welcome to our first panel of the day. So for 2 days now, we have been talking and sort of breaking our brains about the value of land. For the most part, we have been talking about monetizing. But what about the things that are harder to value? For instance, land has meaning, land has significance, land has power, and how do we value those things? I don't have the answers. I will say that Brad Gentry has been teaching a course here at Yale School of the Environment for 20 years called Strategies for Land Conservation. For the past handful of years, I've been co-teaching that with him. And Katie Michaels over here was our inimitable TA in the most recent semester. I mentioned that because in that course, we introduced some framing questions for land conservation practitioners. Land conservation, how? Why? For whom? And critically, what is changing? We've talked a lot this week about how land conservation happens. We've focused mostly on funding and financing. We've talked about why. We've mostly talked about things like climate change, carbon, biodiversity, clean water, access to nature. And there's so much more to the why. In order to even inch our way farther down that road of why, we have to ask about 1,000 more questions. And we need to keep asking all of those questions so that constantly, forever, we can attend to what is changing so that everyone can learn so that better things can happen. So questions such as, who is benefiting? We're talking about land conservation. Who is harmed? Who was harmed long ago or yesterday or today? Who is missing in the conversation? Who's missing in the strategy? Who is not at the table? Who set the table? Who built the table? Is this whole table metaphor fundamentally flawed and we should just throw it out the window? Maybe. What happened on the land that is proposed for being protected? How does that history affect what happens on the land in the future? Who has access to the resources to protect land? Who has access to the funding programs, to the environmental markets, to the equity investors, to all this stuff and the ideas that we've been talking about? So that's what this session is about all of these questions and a lot more. It's about access and equity and justice in conservation and conservation finance. What are our roles? What are our responsibilities in the work and how we interact with land and money? We all have a role to play. All of us individually, the organizations we represent, both internally and externally. I'm really excited to welcome our panelists. We have, in order, Chaka Wade of the Black Farmer Fund, Mavis Gragg of HeirShares, Sacha Spector, Doris Duke Foundation, and Michael Gelobter, Yale Center for Environmental Justice. They are each going to talk for a few minutes about their work, about their perspective on equity and justice in conservation, and then they'll be in dialogue with each other and with all of us. So with that, Chaka is going to get us started.
Walker, thanks so much. That was a wonderful introduction. Thanks everyone for coming out this morning. So I'm Chaka Wade, investment director at Black Farmer Fund. We're a 501c3 nonprofit community-led investment fund based out of New York, but we mostly work virtually We were focused from the start on New York State and specifically supporting Black-owned farms and food businesses in New York State with integrated capital, as we call it. So a combination of grants, low-interest loans, and technical assistance. The impact that we try to achieve is ecological, social, and also focused on wealth creation. There's a long history of disenfranchisement of Black folks on the land. Farmers in 1920, there were close to 1 million Black-owned and Black-led farms in the U.S. And that number has decreased to a handful of thousand, a couple thousand Black-owned farms in the U.S. And so it is our goal to bring Black folks back into close connection to the land and to the food system. Our pilot fund in 2021 was $1 million oversubscribed, and we worked with 8 farms across New York State and food businesses, ranging from vegetable farms, meat producers, to herbalist and a luxury cosmetics provider that use CBD oil for products. And we're very interested in, like I mentioned, we have an ecological focus, so we're interested in farmers who use rotation cover crops. We're looking currently at a hemp producer in Danbury, Connecticut, who focuses on carbon. And so the fund we launched this year is $20 million in size, but it's not just the capital we're focused on. We consider TA probably the largest part of our capital, technical assistance. So that's business support, legal support, and just building a network so that folks can get on their feet and stay on their feet and become sustainable. How are we doing on time? Okay, 2 minutes? Oh, okay, that's plenty of time. So as I mentioned, for the second fund, we're branching out and we're covering the Northeast from Maine down to Pennsylvania. And we're talking to a vintner who moved from California and got some land in Vermont, but found herself under investigation from the state about her licensing, and they shut down her business for a year. They, in the end, finished their investigation and said, no harm, no foul, you're fine to restart your business again, but she lost a year of traction. And so, we're here to support her. We had a farmer in upstate New York who, through the USDA, got admitted to a program where they were refunding him or reimbursing him for his high tunnels. These are, greenhouses. And when it came down to getting that reimbursement, the local authorities gave him a hard time. And so we mobilized legal support and were able to get his reimbursement accomplished. And we're now looking at any businesses that affect the food system. So if there were, perhaps a tech company, startup tech company that focused on software that controlled, that tracked distribution of farm to city produce, then we might be interested in that. So the idea is to put Black people in touch with fresh local food and have them have ownership in the system as well. Ownership, education, and resilience. So thank you.
Nice to meet you, Chaka. We did just meet a little bit ago. So I'm Mavis Gragg. I am CEO of HeirShares. For the folks that I do know in the room, you probably are most familiar with my work at the American Forest Foundation, where I have been the director of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program. But largely, I'm a death and dirt attorney. And the people that I care most about and that I work with and where my work is driven are families who maintain generational land as a primary asset and who are land rich, cash poor. And I say that specifically because those families, I believe, are critical to climate resiliency. And so some of the questions that you asked, one question that I think we also need to ask is, who is needed? Who is needed in order to be climate resilient? Who is needed to achieve our conservation goals? I'm only in the conservation forestry space for the last 7 years. And I came to this space because in my law practice, I was working with people who were overwhelmed with legal issues. And the issues may seem pretty simple. You know, those of you in the conservation space are familiar with clear title. The people I worked with, they came to me because they wanted a plan, they wanted a strategy, but because they didn't have clear title, we had to do that first, and that exhausted their resources. So when we talk about conservation finance, when we're talking about families, ag producers, whatever, who are land rich, cash poor, legal finance is actually part of conservation finance. And so I was drawn to the conservation space and the forestry space because I saw opportunity. You know, when I had conversations with families about how difficult it would be and how expensive it would be and how much time it would take, they wanted to balk. They didn't want to pursue it, which led to undermanagement, which led to potential for loss and development of you know, very important natural resources. And so for me, joining the board of a regional land trust gave me the opportunity to understand how wealthy families use their land to protect the environment, to protect natural resources. And I saw a lot of money, not flowing to the people who need it the most. And so that's how I ended up in the space. And so over the last 7 years, both through board service and working with the American Forest Foundation, I've learned a lot about a few things. One, as it relates to equity and justice. One, when it comes to equity and justice in conservation finance, we have to put people first, which I think is very uncomfortable for conservation organizations, especially when there are, you know, species that we want to protect and water that we want to protect. But when you're working with people who are land rich, cash poor, they often are experiencing other systemic issues that can frustrate actual stewardship of their land. And so we have to be willing to be open to what those additional issues are and be willing to support addressing those issues for the greater cause of conservation. Another thing that I learned is that I know I'm an attorney, we completely undervalue the significance of trusted and good legal services for landowners that we want to participate in our conservation. For those who are land rich, cash poor, we relegate their issues to pro bono and free legal services. Thinking about your landowners that you've worked with, you know, those conservation deals that you've done with them, could that have been achieved with them having a pro bono attorney or a legal aid attorney? I believe the answer is no. And so I do want to make a plug for, you know, considering in conservation finance that we need to have an ecosystem of trusted, well-equipped attorneys who work with these landowners who have these critical intersectional issues. The other thing that I've learned through this experience, particularly with my role with AFF, is that partnership is very nuanced. There's a spectrum of partnership that starts on the light side with just sharing what we do. And then it deepens with, you know, coordinating what we're doing so there's alignment. And then on the deepest end is transformative work. My program, the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program, dove deeply into transformative work without the necessary trust. And so if I can offer any advice on that, I would love to, you know, in our conversation, talk about, you know, in terms of organizations working together to do equitable and just conservation finance. Partnership is a critical factor in understanding what partnership is, what it isn't, and being willing to take time in building partnership is incredibly valuable. Sacha?
Thanks, Mavis. And hi, I'm Sacha Spector, Program Director for the Environment at Doris Duke Foundation. And I really like the way you walked us through some of the things you learned along the way. I did my senior research project in that window, like right there. So this feels like a learning trip for me too. I'm at the Doris Duke Foundation, which is a $2 billion endowment, which operates a national grant making operation on 5 very different topics, and operates 2 centers, one in New Jersey at Duke Farms and one in Hawaii at Shangri-La. I think we come to this question and this set of challenges, both systemic and particular, from lots of different ways, and we're trying to think about how we can bring our entire organization, to bear on all of its assets, to bear on some of the challenges that you've both just surfaced. One is just what happens with our money, right? And that's in the endowment side. And so we've been shifting our endowment and putting in place a whole set of screens and ways to make sure that our endowment, which is essentially an allocated capital pool to different managers, is being managed more by a more diverse pool of managers, and supporting a more diverse pool of founders and business ventures in the process. On the grant making side, our environment program is about ensuring that the benefits of conservation writ large are equitably distributed, and that means a lot of different things. It means addressing where the grant dollars go, yes, but if the benefits and the barriers to those benefits flowing are systemic, then sometimes it takes addressing systemic challenges. And you mentioned some of the funding issues that have been inherent in from the USDA, for example. Well, we just launched an initiative around indigenous-led conservation. Tribes, which control 5% of the land area of the country, have 0 federal baseline funding, like 0. Right? So the Navajo Nation has 17 million acres under its control, gets 0 baseline dollars to manage those places from the federal government. So we have policy level changes to access existing federal flows that have to be addressed. So there's stuff like that, all the way down to the land tenure issues that you mentioned for tribes, including tribes that aren't recognized by the federal or even state governments. And so we're working on things like baseline federal funding, but also allocating resources to partnerships like the Ramapo Lenape tribe on the border of New York and New Jersey to partner with the New Jersey Land Conservancy to set up a new land trust and acquire the first piece of land that tribe has had in almost 300 years. So there's an incredible range of opportunity to drive equity and justice on the land, and to think about ways that finance sometimes unlocks it. So sometimes it's capital, sometimes it's loans to enable that kind of early project development. Sometimes it's loans, bridge loans for finance, for actual land projects. But increasingly, with all of the federal resources and things that we see, there's amazing need for that technical assistance. And so we've been working to support technical assistance providers that are writing grants for or writing grants with community-based organizations and other organizations around the country that are making sure the benefits of this incredible federal windfall are actually trickling down and making sure that the benefits are flowing equitably. That's not easy work, and it's hard to even grapple with where all the money is coming through that federal windfall, so to speak. But that's one of the ways that philanthropy can help sort this out. Another thing that we've been doing is supporting for over a decade a conservation finance initiative led by the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy to generate local and state money, public money, for conservation. Well, we've been working with them really closely to shift the way they think about where they do that work, right? Not our advisor, Peter Stein, likes to say, well, maybe we don't need to help Marin County pass its 6th bond for conservation finance. But that's true, and that's right. But if you go to Colorado and you look at how much money like Denver has, right? You go further south down the Front Range, that's the same landscape, vastly different amount of resources. And so thinking about how we really shift our attention to generating the resources that enable a truly inclusive conservation movement, that enable everybody to be the land stewards that they want to be, that enable them to live out the same connection with land that I think everybody in this room understands. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
You got your own.
Thanks. And my name is Michael Gelobter again. I'm the executive director of the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. And I've been working on environmental justice quite a bit. And we're at the center, we're just sort of starting to really grow our programs now, but we have a huge amount of work in Indian country. Professor Torres, who's the faculty sponsor of it, is doing a lot of work just in land trust work around the country, as well as looking at the Yale forest. One of our lecturers is a guy named Pat Rogers Gonzalez, who led the Bears Ears Coalition struggle for 5 years, the successful one. And I just want to appreciate and I'm going to sort of we think of ourselves as, there's sort of 2 pieces of work in environmental justice, 2 big categories, I would say, reactive and generative. They're both really important, meaning there are people who are being hurt and screwed and because of their lack of power and historical racism and stuff. But we're also facing unprecedented crises at a global level, and the solutions lie within a lot of the most marginalized communities as well. So I want to try to give a little bit of background of how that kind of thinking applies to conservation work as far as I know it. I'm not a super deep conservation expert, but and I appreciate it. But I think one of the things that all of our panelists did do was sort of point to root causes, right? Whether you say there used to be 1 million Black farmers, you go, oh, wow, something changed, right? Whether it's about death and dirt, right? Or about just looking down a mountain range and going, why isn't that part getting more money, right? So there is really a practice of sort of looking at what's on its face. So I was the director of environmental quality and one of the 6 people running the New York City Water Agency at the time. We created the Watershed Protection Program. I was even more of a pollution-oriented person back then than I am now, but it was plainly clear that it was critical financially for the city to not have to build, billions to tens of billions of dollars in additional water treatment to be able to drink our water. So that was really the core motivation. I think we built alliances with a lot of the forces in New York City that are about land preservation in the state. We had a lot of struggles with upstate constituencies like farmers and dairy farms and things like that, but, found our way, I think, to a happy medium. I was more sort of at the conceptual level. There were people upstate and people in our agency who knew a lot more about how to manage those constituencies and things, people with badges even. We have cops up there. But I think it's an example of the criticality of sustainable urban finance and how it's linked to conservation finance. We are facing fundamentally a tsunami of land crises coming with climate change. I was sort of stunned to find from a Miami native that the road on Miami Beach is flooded like every month now. And I do know because I've been working on climate a while, what Florida looks like if the West Antarctic ice shelf melts. And it's probably just going to be a bunch of nice Everglades, a lot of it, or Everglades that look like I Am Legend, maybe, like with buildings sticking out of it. So meaning places that you can go that will be accessible in boats and things, and that might be interesting to visit, but will not be habitable for day-to-day life. And that's going to happen for parts of Florida this century, and it's going to happen all over the world. And there are solutions that make it affordable for people to adapt. I can't go into them right now, but they do have to do with property ownership and capital structures in urban markets and capital structures around land. And if you think of those the right way, all of this stuff can be adapted to in a way that doesn't break the bank and doesn't hurt that many people. But it does require a change in thinking about what property ownership and assets mean. And how do we optimize them for social capital outcomes, for things that are benefit to the whole community or benefit the region and things like that. That we also, in our own work, we're facing a huge amount of demand for work around the fact that there's a Native American person running the Department of Interior, which is radically shifting sovereignty regimes around the country and creating a tremendous opportunity and capacity needs to fill the opportunities she's creating. So that's one is sort of just about the finance part. I want to say that a big piece of how to think about these questions, I think, is also divorcing our old ideas about who this is for, right? Why do I even, for example, think of a quaint New England dairy farmer differently than I think of a Black upstate farmer or a farmer in the South? What we have to, I think, really query ourselves as to what our stereotypes are about the kinds of landholders who are stewards of the land. And understand there are many different types of land stewards that go back centuries, millennia, in some cases on this continent and other places. And the reality also is that, the illusion, certainly true in climate and also true in land conservation, is that the public support, the votes for these bond initiatives come from our communities, come from BIPOC communities. In the climate space, it's really clear. If you're an elected official whose voters are all white, you are anti-climate policy, right? So why did the philanthropic community give 1.3% of their money to people of color organizations for all of its history so far, when the power base is in our communities? And that's, as you all know from bond initiatives and other things, those are powered by and large by voters of color in terms of the margins of victory. Finally, there's a lot of amazing new work happening around the roots of these problems. And so I want to go now to sort of who is an investor, who is a holder of wealth, and what does that mean with respect to land? I'll just end by, there's a great book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, but in general, there's a huge amount of new insight or new realization, right? Why would a continent, and think about just even our land regimes and how they flow from ideas of kings and sovereignty, right? Why would a continent full of people who had been living under terrible despotism for 16 centuries all of a sudden get fixated on liberty and equality in the form of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Stuart Mill and Locke and others? Well, it's because they were colonizing people who lived in democratic and egalitarian societies. And there's the most widely read book in the 17th century was a debate between a Condiaronk chief, Huron chief, and the French governor of Quebec. And the guy comes off like Plato. He says to the French governor, well, wait, so you have private property? And the guy goes, yeah, it's amazing. It's efficient. It's incredible. And the chief says, so you got to have jails, right? Right. So, there is really a lot of wisdom and a lot to be learned from sort of rebooting the kind of dominance that has led to the property structures and the conservation structures that we have now. There's a lot of creativity and new structures that we're going to need, given the vast need for thinking about land very differently that's coming just from climate change and also just from the way we live today. Thanks.
We're gonna try something where we have each sort of have a question for each other, and we'll see where that leads to, and we're going to make sure that we leave time for you to ask questions as well. But this is it's an experiment, so we'll see. Yeah.
So as someone who's not as deeply steeped as many of you in this work, again, sort of, I know from doing this work a while that in the backs of the minds of many folks who are new to it, or many folks who are just have privilege and money, the question is, well, why do we have to treat Black farmers or BIPOC landholders differently? What are why do they need more subsidies or special treatment? And I thought I'd love to hear sort of what our panelists think, how they answer that question. Thanks.
I can start and then pass it on. But yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one. So there's a long history, but if you go back to 1862, there are a couple of acts passed: the Homestead Act of 1862, and I believe the Morrill Act of 1862 that banned slaves, or people in captivity, as my father calls them, from owning land. And so it started with that legacy, and then the USDA has done a study and concluded that there was a systematic discrimination with respect to lending from the USDA going back to the early part of the 20th century, at least. And they've quantified it as 300 some odd billion dollars of damage that was done, but it doesn't take into account the spin-off effects of that, meaning, people forced to move to urban centers and away from their land, and the lack of wealth passed down by generations due to air property problems, and just the lack of awareness in the community about good food and farming and being close to the land and having access to culturally relevant food. For example, one of our farms is a Muslim farm that focuses on halal lamb and traditional vegetables from their community in West Africa. And then we've got Farm Fresh Caribbean in upstate New York, and they focus on callaloo and other okra and other traditionally vegetables from the Caribbean. And so there's been just a legacy of discrimination sanctioned even by the government for so many years. And then the problem is a lot of the farmland is located in areas that don't have exposure to Black folks, or Black folks don't have exposure to the people up there. So in New York State, for example, we do have farmers who face discrimination from their neighbors and hostility from their neighbors. And so all of this has hindered the ability of Black folks to stay close to the land, to understand how to treat the land well, to have access to healthy food. And so, yeah, there's just, let's see, it's such a long legacy of this problem that it's hard to know when we're going to be finished addressing the problem. I don't know if there's an end goal to it, but earlier I mentioned there are a couple of thousand farmers in the U.S., Black-owned farms in the U.S. I think the number's between 50 and 60,000, and so it's 94% maybe decline since 1920.
To add to that, I think these specialized funding or initiatives are needed essentially as a workaround, because the traditional models of financing are so baked in that they're inflexible, and pivoting away from that is hard. And so to give you an example, equip dollars largely go to large white male landhold. Well, the land is large. Just to be clear. But a lot, if you look at how equip dollars are distributed, the system is so I guess restrictive that we don't see a lot of dollars getting to everyone else. And so through the SFLR program, for example, the state conservationists were willing to create separate pools for BIPOC farmers on the condition that they were working with a program that was providing them with support in, navigating the practices that they were putting on the ground. But that actually helped USDA deliver on its own goals of getting more equip dollars to BIPOC farmers, because they created a separate pool, like it was necessary to even deliver on their own goals. So I think that's another reason why these kind of specialized initiatives exist, because the systems that we have traditionally worked in are inflexible. And so we need innovation. We need to change the model, as you pointed out earlier.
I guess, I don't have a lot to add. I guess land and power are just so intimately connected, and that the entire financial structure that was built around protecting power inevitably wound up influencing land, right? And so thinking about how we undo that has any number of kind of valences, right? Whether it's farm loss or heirs property issues, or out here in the East, where so many tribes were displaced before the concept of a reservation was even imagined. There are tribes with no land, there are tribes with an acre, and very little prospect for regaining it. So the kind of power that comes from owning land and having control over it is, I think at the root of it. I guess the other part about is that the ripple effects of that are seen everywhere, where every city in America, you can tell where the red lines were by where the trees are today, right? Like the urban tree patterns are the echo of redlining. And so, but undoing that inevitably means financing it somehow. And the other part of land control and land loss is that the big properties are often, owned by white institutions, and the smallholders who have the hardest time accessing finance writ large are communities of color and landowners of color. So one thing, for example, that we've started investing in is we're kind of neutral on whether, carbon offsetting is a great thing, or well, we're not neutral, but our policy is that we're sort of neutral, and but making sure that access to these sources of financing is open and more equitable, right? So we're supporting, the city forest credits program that's enabling urban tree planting to get carbon financing, or the National Indian Carbon Coalition, which is helping tribes access the carbon, or the Family Forest Carbon Program to enable smallholders who have less than, say, 5,000 acres to access. I think what we need to do is really lean into ensuring that the access to the levers that undo this power imbalance is really open to as many players as possible.
My question, so I have answer.
Can we stipulate that you can answer your own question?
Oh, no, those are great answers, those are great. I mean, I think the root stuff is all things that on top of what we think is on top of what we think that is. There's also, we're in an unprecedented era of additional change environmentally and land wise. So, not knowing the roots and running into even a more extreme situation is not a good idea. So.
One thing I'd like to ask the panel is what their experience is on practices that conserve the land, that change the concept of ownership, because I think ownership has been seen as extractive. Like, I have control over this land, I'm just going to make as much profit as possible from it. And I think the original state of ownership here with the indigenous folks was about loving the land, and ownership meant taking care of it as you would a family member. And, and so, yeah, I'd just like to know what people's observations have been as far as, people who are trying to change the narrative back to that.
I cringe. I mean, just honestly, I cringe because of my role, as an attorney who are working with people on ownership issues. I am advancing the security of ownership at the same time thinking is ownership the right thing to do? So, kind of to your point, I would love for us to return to a time when ownership was what you described. I just have very little faith that that would happen because of, I'm just going to say it, capitalism.
Yeah.
And so, when I'm working with landowners who, a lot of people are coming to me who want to farm, who want food security that they get to lead, and they want to do it with a cooperative model. And they have these beautiful ideas, they have these beautiful proposals. And I'm like, it's not going to work, because I know conflict, I know the law, and those two things frustrate that kind of collaborative model in relationship with the land. So, but call me a pessimist. I would love to hear a different opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's I hate to harp on this too much, but there are all kinds of embedded. If we really look at the present situation with what's happening with the environment, there's going to be a lot of expropriation by the climate. And what we do in the United States, that in many years, 80% of US federal spending is on climate disaster relief, believe it or not. 8% of US discretionary spending in some years. I mean, right? Houston costs us $150 billion, that hurricane, right? So there's this embeddedness of like, well, it's my land and it got flooded, fix it, that we're not going to be able to afford. And around the world, people aren't going to be able to afford this. So there's going to be there is an expropriation underway that is not being driven by Marxism, but by climate change. and you can think of it as expropriation by the climate, taking land out of circulation, or by the people who own the land, taking money from us to fix the problems that they have because they're in low-lying areas or things like that. So there's a real opportunity to sort of try to turn that into a win-win, where a lot more communal models. I mean, one of the central issues, I mean, like just, I'm a native New Yorker, I'll just use that example. Maybe 30, I don't know exactly how many, but likely 30% of subway stations are not viable in New York City in the next 30 or 40 years. If we took that seriously and started working on it now, including the ownership regimes around, because there's really tight linkage between transportation and land value, right? We could start generating different kinds of value for the landowners, right? But it's not like they're going to flip it to somebody else. There's another way they're going to make money, and there's going to be community development around that land because of those transformations. It's going to be a lot more Everglades in Florida, like that could be huge for economic development in Florida if people were willing to look at it that way, instead of like, well, my mall has to stay above water, right? Or things like that. So there's a lot of, unfortunately, natural processes happening that are forcing this. The other thing, I think the question we run into a lot in social justice work around land and value extraction is also when you create a community ownership. I'm more familiar again in urban settings, like the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative has done work around land trusts within cities. Is how do you give people the right, and the more there is return of land, this has been coming up like with the Baker Beach situation in Los Angeles, how do you give people the right to earn wealth appropriately, even if the land is locked up in some way, right? And there are actually a lot of creative ways to think about that. I'm not an expert in them, but there are examples around the world of how to both preserve territory or places and have the people who own them, within a capitalist system, even have not just reasonable return, but real return and ability to garner wealth off their assets without necessarily depleting the asset. I think there are a lot of ways to do it, and we ought to just all know more about those and try to learn to be creative about them.
Yeah, I really love that idea of finding new ways to distribute those benefits for, in the process of conservation to the local communities. I think your question for me raises two questions. One is, do we have the right conservation instruments that really honor those kind of different cultural models and different relationships to the land? And then secondarily, this question of, whether we're reinforcing the wrong kind of property rights and private property model in the process. And I think there are a lot of different groups that are looking at that. Nowhere is that more immediate than for the some of the tribal and indigenous led organizations who are trying to recapture some of their traditional homelands. And there's some folks in, I guess, Massachusetts, where the Native Land Trust and the Northeast Wilderness Trust, I think, are grappling with this challenge in a very immediate way, which is, they want to co-manage a piece of land. They want to essentially co-own it. And in the process, they don't want to reinforce the idea that this is private property. And so I think that's an unbelievable opportunity for innovation and to think about what are the right. My idea is to put the land in trust with itself as the beneficiary, and only things that benefit the land in perpetuity can be done for it and done to it. But who knows? I don't know if that works. But I'm not a lawyer, but you are. So, but I think the idea of trying to upend these long legacies of of land ownership and rights in the existing framework is incredibly exciting and somewhat subversive, and that's where we should be, right?
Ask.
Thank you. I'm Libby Kamalo. I work with World Wildlife Fund and the Buffalo Nations Grasslands Alliance in the Northern Great Plains. I am curious if you all would like to weigh in on the role of grant terms with philanthropic organizations and the idea of building capacity of people to manage and steward the land. So I'm hearing a lot about land acquisition. That's really important. I've been sharing at the same time that I work with folks like Chalmer Kumbelik, who's the one wildlife biologist with Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, that works on 1.3 million acres and needs, more, they want more support staff. So just curious about your thoughts on grant cycles and investing in human capacity and personnel in relation to land acquisition and the trade-offs of those kind of things. Another example I'll bring in is that Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies has been incredible. They've invested in World Wildlife Fund since before 2015 on 3-year grant cycles that keep getting renewed. And that's created the opportunity for Buffalo Nations Grasslands Alliance to form and become its own independent Native-led organization in 2021. In my experience, in my career, it seems like it's unusual to have that long-term of investment in those kind of things from a philanthropic organization. I do have an agenda in asking that question. Thank you.
Clarifying question. When you say you think 3 years is long?
Multiple 3-year grant cycles. No, I don't think 3 years on its own, but they invest over and over with the idea is you perform well based on your vision and that agreed vision, and it continues. That's my understanding of it. I don't want to mischaracterize Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, but the fact that it's multiple, 3-year grants.
So I'll be honest, your question was long and I may not have captured it fully, but I'll try to respond. I will say that I think that, or in my experience with the SFLR program, I think the grant cycles are actually too short. We're talking about, Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program. So this program has 8 community-based organizations in 8 states. Each of them are new to forestry, and not all of them have worked in conservation before. So there was a huge learning curve, but then there's also a huge capacity deficit for many of them in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their operational structure, et cetera. But there was a ton of interest in funding this program because it is a high impact program. But what we saw was that absorption of funds was challenging, and stewarding those funds and actually getting impact on the ground in mostly 2-year cycles, but sometimes 3-year cycles was actually very difficult in terms of the impacts on the ground and impacts for the landowners. It's a lot to manage in a short period of time. And it's a lot to, we're talking about constituents who need transformative change against systemic issues. So I do think grant cycles, I'm glad you asked that question because I do think that is a challenge. And so, yeah, I'd be curious, what Sacha, for example, and Chaka, what you all think about that from the funder perspective.
I'm happy to go, but you go.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I'm not super experienced in the grant space, in the fundraising side of the grant space. We're a startup. I came from Wall Street, so I mean, there were no grants involved in what I was doing, but I know that we operate best under, when there are as few conditions as possible. I mean, I don't know. And the 3-year cycles, I mean, that's probably fine with us. I mean, I don't know if we have a strong preference either way as far as like a 3-year cycle. We're a startup and we have track record of our pilot fund, and we're on to our second fund now. It's going to be like higher stakes and everything, but 3 years just feels appropriate. I mean, how fast do you know?
If only there was a grant maker here. I think this is a hard question. And I think I'll come at it kind of like 2 ways. One is, it's undeniable that every organization would thrive more if it had more flexible, longer duration capital from philanthropy. There's no I don't think anybody would argue about that. The flip side of that is that we're social investors. Right? I'm trying to solve a problem like conserving 30% of the nation's lands and waters over the course of this decade with $20 million a year, right? And so the idea of funding place-based work, in perpetuity is not the way for me as an investor to get to a goal as audacious as that. And so there's a balancing point. And I think, fortunately, part of the solution there is that there's a ridiculous amount of diversity in the philanthropic space, where there are local and regional based funders who have a real concern with the ecosystem of organizations in their places and don't see their role as trying to solve policy issues. There's others like us who are trying to carry national issues to the fore. And so hooking up with the right set of funders. And the other part is that when I think about a big national challenge like that, it's recognizing the capacity on the ground that's required to do that, again, is wall to wall, coast to coast, 24/7, and my resources aren't enough. So I go after things like making sure that there's baseline federal funding for the tribes, including the Intertribal Buffalo Council, so that I'm not trying to give you 3 nickels every 3 years, but you have the resources you need time over time.
There was a question about well, first on the funding side, I think I don't know how connected the conservation funding community is to the broader thinking about progressive funding, but this is an issue generally in progressive funding, is that the grant cycles are smaller. So the people who started the Heritage Foundation said, we'd like estate taxes to go away, and here's 30 years worth of money to make sure we get there. And there is a really tight connection between the length of grant cycle and whether there's a return to rich people from your philanthropic work. Which is why it's genetically easier to fund right-wing work than it is to fund progressive work. It's genetically easier to fund work that enriches rich people than it is to fund work that creates more equality, because the pools of money, there's a return on investment for that. So I don't know how that plays in conservation, but it's a core problem with philanthropic funding. And you can maybe as a team think about how to jack up your funders about that. And also, I can't imagine like an arena where you could make a better case for long-term funding, right, than conservation. And these are even questions around spend down for really big foundations. Some really well-known foundations 20 years ago, older ones, started thinking about spend down. And some of their program officers were like, I don't really know what problem would be more valuable to think about spend down on than stopping climate change, or preserving species that are going away, right? So it's like, my grandchildren will be able to make decisions about money, or the species will be gone, right? Which is like, one feels like forever, right? And then one's maybe about your grandchildren, right? So those are questions. So then the capacity, I think within your question is also the capacity issue. And I don't know how how the finance community thinks. Certainly at Yale, we're thinking a lot about that. And that has its own benefits. I don't think anybody who's going to get any Indigenous person who gets a degree who could contribute to the management of 1.5 million acres is going to have a job. Because whether they work on Indian country or they work on flooded lands, I mean, there's so much going on with the planet right now that it's a booming industry. Sometimes people don't quite understand. There were really deep drivers. It's like Warren Buffett says every morning, 3 billion men get up and shave their face, which is why I own Gillette, right? Well, every morning the ocean is getting higher and things like, and so there's a lot of work. So just think about the capacity building and how that generates new thinking and new resources potentially as well.
We have a question in the back, and then we'll come to you.
Hello. I'm so excited that you all are here. This was so great. So thank you so much. My name is Soraya Hamidi. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation and an Indigenous community liaison at Blue Forest. So we're a conservation finance nonprofit. Again, so excited you're all here. This was amazing. My question is for Sacha, Doris Duke. Super excited about your partnership with Native Americans in philanthropy. I guess these days, certainly a lot is coming up with Indigenous land reclamation. And I'm curious from a foundation's perspective, do you find it to be important with providing grants for land reclamation projects that that land is going to be able to sustain itself and kind of be on its own, producing economic value. Is that something that you think about? We've talked a lot about ecosystem services and about credits and about different ways that funds can kind of channel back after an initial acquisition of land. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, is that something that's important or something that's preferred? Or because you're coming from the foundation side, that return isn't something that's as important? Thank you.
So first off, I think part one of that question, our priority is that if we're supporting land rematriation or return or however you describe it, that the control of the land is going back, and that we're exploring lots of different ways to help make that happen at a much faster pace. The heart of the question, though, is like what are the uses of those lands, and how does it sustain itself? How does and for us as well, typically it's how do we help ensure that the conservation values in a lot of those cases are being supported and maintained over time. And I don't think there's a easy answer to that, because just like every other land conservation deal, it's going to look like a lot of different things, right? And so one thing we're supporting a piece of legal research now to figure out how tribes might get paid for conservation easements on reservation land, right? It's already held in trust, but they're not getting any resources for the permanent protection of parts of their reservation that they know or they never want to see developed. So that's a economic driver that's not available to a huge number of tribes, right? The carbon markets, for working forest lands, for example, is something that we're supporting. So I don't think there's a blanket answer to your question, because I think it looks like the incredible range of colors of money and land that we see in the wider conservation world.
Hi. So this is more of a comment. I just wanted to say I am loving this conversation. As I've been reflecting on the last few days, sitting in this conversation, it just feels very right as we move forward and address the challenges that are before us. I wanted to provide a comment, Sacha, that we were talking about land and putting the land in trust. So there's this thing that we battle with, right? We live in today, we live in this capitalist system, and yet we need to evolve to something better, a healthier relationship with the land, a healthier relationship with each other. And so how do we use the systems that are here today to get us farther along the path that we need to go? I was at an environment and social justice conference a few months ago, and incredibly popular topic was this woman from New Zealand who gave an example of how there is an area where they gave personhood to a mountain. And as crazy as that sounds, we give personhood to corporations. So why not give personhood to land and then have a board that looks at the interest of the land? And it's an interesting system. It's being tried in different places. And so I think there are creative ways for us to use our capitalist system and evolve. So anyway, I'm just loving this conversation, and thank you for all the hard work that you do every day.
Hey, my name is Ashley Stewart. I am at the Connecticut Green Bank, and I'm curious to hear you all's comments about just partnership generation. You're talking about reaching people that aren't typically reached. So can you talk a little bit more about that for your individual work? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I'll start. So we have an ecosystem of organizations that help us do our work. For example, NEFOC, Northeast Farmers of Color, and they're great with land access. We have Corbin Hill Project. We work closely with them, some of the financing, as well as pot liquor capital. Mark Watson, people may or may not know the name, is leader of Pot Liquor Capital, and they help us. And we go in together sometimes on projects, and we maintain a list serve, and as we expand into New England, we are communicating with folks on the ground and starting to build our network throughout the Northeast states. And yeah, Connecticut. Okay, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Do you know Daishan here? You New Haven? Are you okay? Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. So our investment committee makes most of the decisions as far as investment, and we have it's 10 people, and they're in a variety of states throughout in New England and down to Pennsylvania, and so we're represented on the ground in the places, in the communities where we're trying to direct capital and technical assistance. And so it's an expanding network, and we rely on each other, and it's growing. So
I'll speak again from my experience with the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program, because that program was driven by partnership. You have in the overarching partnership, 2 USDA agencies, NRCS and the U.S. Forest Service. And then you have a couple of private foundations. And then you have the U.S. Endowment and AFF. And then the 8 Black-led small community-based organizations who actually work directly with the landowner. So those relationships are critical to the success of the program, and navigating those relationships, building those relationships even is it's challenging. I think it's a good challenge, but I think it's easy to take for granted in this space, in the conservation space, how easily those kind of relationships around money are formed, where you're when you're looking at like people, the end user who has a lot of issues. So I don't know if that made sense, but what I'm trying to say is that I do think organizations need, in the conservation space, need to think differently about who are potential partners, and again, build slowly, build those relationships slowly, and don't dive deep. I think, if I can be honest, no one from AFF is here. I think AFF and the U.S. Endowment, quite frankly, I think we dove deep quickly because we cared about the issues, but without having the necessary trust and not having an understanding of what are we aligned with. American Forest Foundation is a family forest owner serving organization, and this program services family forest owners. So it seems logical, but there are a lot of other issues that AFF doesn't work on. AFF does not work on heirs property. AFF doesn't work, carbon markets aren't applicable, at least in my view right now, to landowners who have 30 acres and unclear title. And so I encourage learning and sharing a lot ahead of diving deep.
Quickly, from the perspective of an educational institution, one of the things I think it's really important to just keep working in the field on the value experts bring, the value you bring here. And you can accelerate partnership, maybe not dive deep super fast, but you can accelerate partnership by being grounded in what you know, right? You're doing innovative finance deals, and you know who can't participate yet, right? And you can go in and ask and treat them like leaders and still know what the heck you're talking about, right? And a lot of times I think people with a lot of knowledge and a lot of power in the environmental field, the most powerful civil rights laws in the country are the environmental rights. Like, we went into the 60s looking for health and jobs and education. We got a right to clean air. We didn't get a right to a good education or a right to a job or a right to healthcare. We got a right. So those laws are very powerful. And environmentalists often underplay how important they are. You can put people in jail over what happened in Flint, Michigan, and the governor of Michigan actually spent $3 million keeping himself out of jail after the Flint, Michigan scandals. So just knowing the power that the tools we have as conservationists are, being grounded in them without disempowering people, but often our communities have no idea what's really at stake, even in a bond issue, and just being responsible about, it's okay to be in your power, in your expertise, I would say, in your, and thinking about how best to have it serve. the shyness can slow us down sometimes too. So there's humility, but you also have to bring your game.
So my question is, as a member of the land trust community, like you, I'm a native New Yorker, but now I live in rural Pennsylvania and work for a working forest conservation organization. And when I walk on my farm with my kids, I'm acutely aware that we live in a very climate stable place, both now and for predictions for the future, far northwestern PA, if you're looking for a new place to be. But as a land conservation organization, I think about the fact that we are working hard to conserve land and keep it from being converted to non-forest uses. And we also live in a place that is very likely to receive a population influx due to climate migration when other places become unsafe to live. Not the only place, but one of them. And so my question really for each of you and each of the different justices that you have spoken to and that you're trying to remedy, as a land trust, do you ever think in your work on a daily basis, weekly basis, if only the land trusts would ... Like, can you help us be forward thinking to try to help work with heirs property issues more directly, or to accommodate the need and for land and resources for Black farmers, and then for thinking about climate justice? I know this is a huge question, but it just feels like an opportunity with all of these minds in front of me to ask, what can we as land trusts be thinking about doing to make space for some of these issues?
I'll answer first and I'll try to be brief. Just last night, I had the opportunity to have a call with Triangle Land Conservancy and a family that has heirs property in one of the key priority areas for Triangle Land Conservancy. What I love about the Triangle Land Trust's evolution is that Triangle Land Conservancy's evolution in the last few years is that they educated themselves first around what DEIJ is, and then saw alignment through their strategic planning process with the mission and how we pursue the mission. And then more recently arrived at piloting a program in which they would deploy the buy, conserve, sell model, but sell to BIPOC farmers. And spoiler alert, really quickly ran into a fair housing issue, but I appreciate that they have even continued in the journey. And the fair housing issue is that you cannot select a buyer based on race. So they have a really innovative idea that's very different from how they've pursued conservation in their 40-year history. And they've bumped up against the numerous things that can come into play, and they're sticking with it. And so I think as you look at change and how you can have that kind of impact, stick with it. And understand that it's going to be uncomfortable, but it is essentially a startup. And I think that's the one thing that we have to remember. You know, we're trying something very different. It could fail. I'll shut up because there's only 2 more minutes, but I appreciate your question.
I'll do one and then you really bring it home. So I mean, I think, look, land trusts are unique in they live on the ground, you know, they connect people across all sorts of dividing lines back to a very simple premise of like, what does this place be like? What is it and what will it become? And so the land trust opportunity to think about designing and holding lands and landscapes so that they are truly equitable and sustain both the non-human people and the human people in perpetuity is an unprecedented, that's the amazing opportunity that only probably land trusts can navigate in a world that's changing as fast as it is.
Just briefly, I'm not a huge land trust person, but I'm really been very interested in land acknowledgements in the last year or two and talking to my native friends about it. And I'd say, if only all of the acknowledgements dealt with a lot of history and everything else, but also acknowledged what Indigenous people care about, what we all should care about, which is we're not just grateful to Indigenous people, we're grateful to the land. Like, all of us own that piece, and to sort of find our ways of expressing so that we all the cultures who are engaged with the land now can acknowledge it, not just for the history and not just for the expropriation, but for it.
Say thank you to our panelists.